We talked about in a previous segment Donald Trump's first day at trial in his criminal trial in Manhattan and broke down the latest knowledge we have so far of what's been taking place there. And I did that with legal expert Aaron Parnas. But a detail has come out since that's sort of funny and lighthearted that I do want to talk about. That's an anecdote from inside the courtroom of Trump's behavior, I guess you would say. And what we'll do in this segment is first talk about that, and I'll show you what I'm referring to. And it's just funny, but it mainly emphasizes, which is why I want to talk about it, blatant hypocrisy on the part of the right-wing media echo chamber. So that first, then we'll get to debunking a really prominent talking point we hear used in service of Trump amid the conversation about his potential criminality. So one of the ways people defend him is a talking point that we're going to rip to shreds, okay? And in the process of doing that, learn some really interesting insights about an important topic. So with that being said, first, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Clicking the subscribe button goes a long way in growing the show. And here's that reporting that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I have to ask, you guys have been, at the Times, have been live blogging this event. And 40 minutes ago, you wrote an observation that I was very surprised. Trump appears to be sleeping. His head keeps dropping down and his mouth goes slack. Tell us about that.
Well, Jake, he appeared to be asleep, and repeatedly his head would fall down. There have been other moments in other trials, like the Agent Carroll trial, which was around the corner in January, where he appeared very still and seemed as if he might be sleeping, but then he would move. This time, he didn't pay attention to a note that his lawyer, Todd Blanche, passed him. His jaw kept falling on his chest, and his mouth kept going slack. Now, sometimes people do fall asleep during court proceedings, but it's notable given the intensity of this morning and a lot of what was being argued.
Yeah, that's rather surprising.
So by itself, is it horrible? Is it bad? Is Trump doing something wrong by maybe falling asleep inadvertently? No. Now, it's a little strange, to be honest. Day one of your criminal trial, you'd think you'd be paying attention. But even setting that aside, okay, you're really tired. Let's just say, I don't know, you were truth socialing all night and you're tired because of that. I get it. It's just that if Biden did the exact same thing in this serious of a situation, first of all, imagine him being indicted 4 times and having a criminal trial at all. Fox News would lose their minds and say it was disqualifying, and then they won't say that with Trump. But even this specifically, they would do round-the-clock coverage of how Biden's falling apart and his brain is just grumbling and he can't stay awake. And how do I know that? Well, because there have been situations, not this serious, but situations where Biden's sitting in the crowd for something and dozes off a little bit, and Fox News freaks out and does pretend like it's indicative of some broader issue. And they won't do that with Trump here. Now, I know what you're thinking. Is this really a productive use of time calling out hypocrisy? I've learned not really. I mean, often it doesn't change people's views, but it seems like sometimes you just have the obligation to say blatant inconsistency here. They would freak out if this were Biden. They won't. The only chance that we have of them talking about such a story is them saying the liberal media is being so unfair to Trump. And that's proved by the fact that they're doing stories like this one. But again, not the biggest revelation in the world, but points out inconsistency. Then one of the talking points we hear a lot is that, Democrats, they want Trump to be prosecuted, but they don't care about addressing any other types of crimes, right? Crimes raging while they're prosecuting Trump. And even though that's not how the enforcement of laws should work, where if violent crimes, for example, were to spike, you would just stop prosecuting other types of crime or stop holding people accountable for fraud, like Trump's civil case. It's also based on a complete lie about what's going on in the country. And you'll hear Trump say a lot that crime's spiking, but they're coming after me instead of real criminals. And interestingly, that segues us into a really nice, important conversation about what has been happening with crime. And we've talked about it a little bit, but now I have new insights to share with you on that. So to contextualize this conversation as we get into it, in 2020, who was the president in 2020? Trump. And I say it like that because much of the right-wing media is trying to distort the timeline in a really weird way and pretend like Biden took over in a time that he didn't and Trump left in a time he didn't. So Trump was president when 2020 was the year. And in that year, we saw the largest increase in murders ever recorded. Now, I'm not saying that to say that that's because of Trump in full. The pandemic created conditions that created that crime spike. Now, Trump was actively mismanaging those conditions, so there is blame there. But let's just, for simplicity's sake, say pandemic caused that spike. Fair. Well, the reason that it's important to point that out is because that's the super important pretext for the Biden presidency. He had to inherit those circumstances, a crime surge, what he had to take over. And I insist on saying that a few times. That's what he had to take over, because immediately networks like Fox News started pretending like Biden was causing a crime surge that started before Biden was president. And they were just arguing that we shouldn't blame Trump for that crime surge because it was because of the pandemic. Crazy stuff. But that reality and keeping that context in mind makes what we're about to go through even more impressive. And so then, to stay on the Fox News example, they completely decided not to cover, after doing all this coverage of a crime surge, blaming it on Biden when that made no sense. They did not cover and refused to cover the fact that we're currently experiencing one of the most rapid plummets in crime in American history under Joe Biden. Now, because we care about being honest and assessing all the relevant information, not just the politically advantageous ones, should we say that there was probably going to be a decrease in crime in the years following the worst of the pandemic? Yeah, probably. Absolutely. Now, who was president when that recovery was happening? Okay, but let's just say we were going to see a decrease in crime, but was it going to be this rapid and getting crime rates this low? Was that inevitable? And I think the answer is a resounding no, given that in other developed countries, they haven't seen this fast of a decrease in crime. And right now, violent crime got lower than it was before the crisis. So in just 3 years, seeing crime go from elevated levels, historic spike in homicides, down to pre-pandemic levels or lower in the case of violent crime is impressive. And that should be noted. So then it's, are there policies you can point to that could have made this happen, made the crime drop so rapid and it drop so low? And I think the answer on that is absolutely. So just to go through some examples, we don't have time to walk through all the specifics of Biden's policy record as we've done many times in the past, but we'll zero in on a few examples here. And I wish more of the media would do coverage of these sorts of things. Under Biden, and hear me on this, this is just something you'd never hear in a lot of the media, but especially right-wing media. Under Biden, we've seen the largest federal investment in law enforcement, public safety, and violence reduction in American history, while Biden was being accused of defunding the police. Crazy. And obviously, like I said, that's across a bunch of programs that adds up to that. But just to give you a few examples in the recovery effort, specifically the American Rescue Plan was that really necessary legislation that helped to pull us out of the crisis we were in, that provided billions to local governments to prevent police department budget cuts amid that economic pain and to hire more trained and skilled police officers. You also have $1.2 billion invested in Medicaid mobile crisis intervention centers, $1 billion to family violence prevention, and we could go down the list there, but then we'll jump over to executive orders on gun violence. Biden has made history by signing more executive orders on gun violence prevention than any president in American history, I should say. And the latest example of that is one that expands background checks. Then, of course, that brings us to the bipartisan gun safety bill, which was the most significant action on gun violence in decades. So you have this policy record, again, that we can only scrape the surface of. Otherwise, much of the viewers will go away. It'll get too boring. But you actually have this record to speak of that directly impacts these sorts of metrics, and a historic investment in public safety, for example. And then you zoom out from that and think, well, we understand that crime is impacted by broader socioeconomic conditions. So then the broader recovery efforts could have indirectly impacted the reality on the ground when it comes to crime. Absolutely. And I've done a gazillion segments now going through the entire list of policies implemented under Biden, but things like the infrastructure law, that's the largest investment in infrastructure since the Eisenhower Highway Program, creating all these projects in people's communities, employing people and the Chips and Science Act, investing in American manufacturing, creating jobs, more jobs, better economic situation for people. Wages have started to grow faster than inflation. These indirectly create circumstances that will decrease crime rates for sure. And so then I want you to think about, as we consider those facts, think about, or I guess imagine the hypothetical where Trump won in 2020. I know, horrible, but he won re-election and oversaw the same trends. Imagine if he oversaw this sort of recovery that economically outpaced comparable economies and is currently outpacing expectations. And in 3 short years, we went from elevated unemployment, wages down, GDP down, etc., to strong GDP growth, again, outpacing expectations, unemployment lower for longer than we've seen in decades, record job growth, wages, like I said, growing faster than inflation. So that economic story. Then on crime, huge crime spike the pandemic caused, and then just 3 short years later, down to pre-pandemic levels or lower. You would have Fox News coverage of Trump like he was a miracle maker, and you know it. A recovery like that would have impressed every Fox host to the nth degree. They would have been doing Trump booty kissing, the likes of which you rarely see, for lack of a better term. And instead, they distort the facts and try to pretend like everything the pandemic caused is something Biden caused, so any recovery efforts are impressive because that's just addressing things that he caused when he didn't. It is a bummer because we could be having meaningful conversations about, in these areas where we've seen successes, how can we maximize for the variables responsible going forward and make more progress, get crime lower, make the economy better. But instead, a bunch of lies and people are misinformed. And that's really unfortunate. And I wish the media at large would cover these sorts of things more. Let me know what you thought of all that in the comments.